The air in Hollow Creek, Tennessee turned cold the moment James Harper stepped off the bus. It wasn't just the crisp October breeze. Something felt wrong, like a weight settling on his shoulders. He'd come here to escape, a quick vacation, from his crumbling life in Nashville, divorce papers still warm, job teetering on the edge. But as he adjusted his backpack, a shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. Not a person, not a tree, just something. He shook it off. Small towns had their tricks, right? The cabin he'd rented sat alone on a ridge, surrounded by skeletal oaks. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sour. James dropped his bag, lit the fireplace, and poured a whiskey. That's when the scratching started, soft, like fingernails on glass coming from the window. He froze. Nothing but darkness stared back. Then it came again, louder, insistent. By morning, exhaustion clung to him like damp clothes. The scratching hadn't stopped until dawn, and his phone screen flickered with static when he tried to call out. He chalked it up to bad reception, packed up, and caught the next bus home. Vacation over. Problem solved. Or so he thought. Back in Nashville, the shadow followed. At first, it was subtle, a chill in his apartment, a flicker in the bathroom, mirror. Then his keys vanished, reappearing under the couch hours later, coated in a thin layer of frost. He told himself he was stressed, imagining things. But at work, it got worse. James managed a small hardware store, and that Monday, the lights buzzed and dimmed every time he walked by. A shelf of nails collapsed, barely missing his head. Customers complained of a weird vibe, and his boss pulled him aside. "You okay, Harper? You look like death." James forced a smile, but that night the scratching returned, inside his bedroom walls. Sleep became impossible. The shadow grew bolder, a vague silhouette lurking in doorways, its edges blurring like smoke. His coffee turned bitter mid-sip. His clothes reeked of wet earth. At work, tools went missing, only to reappear sharpened and pointed at him from odd angles. Co-workers avoided him, whispering he was cursed. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something had latched onto him. Desperate, James took a week off and drove to Florida, hoping the sun would burn it away. He rented a beachside condo in St. Augustine, but the shadow didn't care. Sand tracked into his room without him stepping outside, and the ocean roared, unnaturally loud at night. One evening, he woke to salt water dripping from the ceiling onto his face. Panic set in. He fled back to Nashville, but the shadow was waiting. His apartment door creaked open on its own, and the air thickened with a rotting stench. The scratching turned to pounding. Inside his skull now. He called his ex-wife, Eleanor, begging for help. She arrived pale, eyes wide. "James, there's something behind you." He turned. The shadow loomed, taller now, its edges sharp, its presence suffocating. Eleanor screamed as it lunged, not at her, but into him. James collapsed, clawing at his chest, feeling it settle inside him like ice. His breath hitched, his vision blurred, and a voice not his own rasped from his throat. Days later, his boss found him at the store, staring blankly at a wall of hammers. "Harper?" No response. James's lips moved, but the voice wasn't. It growled, "Leave." The lights shattered, glass raining down. His boss stumbled back, terror in his eyes. Eleanor tried to reach him again, but his apartment was empty, save for frost on the windows and scratches on every wall. The store, tools moved on their own, and customers swore they saw a shadow trailing James wherever he went. His vacation photos surfaced online, each one with a dark blur behind him, growing sharper, closer. He tried to fight it, locking himself in his apartment, but the shadow seeped through the cracks. The mirrors reflected only it, not him. His voice faded, replaced by whispers that weren't his. Neighbors heard pounding at night, then silence. One morning, Eleanor returned with a priest. The apartment was frigid, the walls scarred with claw marks. James sat in the corner, eyes black, unblinking. The priest began a prayer, but James, or what was left of him, lunged, his voice a guttural snarl. "He's mine. Eleanor fled, the priest's screams echoing behind her. At the store, the shadow lingered. Tools fell without cause, lights flickered in patterns. James's name appeared scratched into the counter, though no one saw him again. His co-workers quit, the store closed, and the building sat abandoned. In St. Augustine, the condo stayed vacant. Locals whispered of salt water pooling on the floor, of a shadow in the windows at night. No one dared rent it again. Back in Hollow Creek, the cabin waited. A new tenant, Thomas Reed, arrived weeks later, seeking a quiet retreat. He unpacked his bags, lit the fireplace, and settled in. That night, the scratching began, soft like fingernails on glass. James was gone, but the shadow wasn't. It followed him home, to work, to the coast, and back again. It wasn't just a presence. It was a parasite feeding on despair, growing stronger with every step he took. It didn't stop with him. Thomas woke the next day, his keys missing, frost on his pillow. He laughed it off. Small towns had their tricks, right? But as he stepped outside, a shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. It wasn't done. It never would be. The shadow didn't just follow, it spread. From Hollow Creek to Nashville, from St. Augustine to wherever its next host fled, it clung like damp rot. It slipped into lives unnoticed, a chill in the air, a flicker in the glass. It waited for the desperate, the weary, the lost. James's fate wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The shadow thrived on his ruin, and now it sought more. Thomas felt it that first night, though he didn't know it yet. The scratching grew louder, the air colder, the weight heavier. By morning, Thomas's phone flickered with static. He packed his bags, ready to leave. But as he stepped onto the bus, the shadow followed. Closer now, sharper. He felt it settle on his shoulders, a weight he couldn't shake. Back in Nashville, Eleanor found James's journal, hidden under frost-covered floorboards. The last entry read, "It's inside me, it won't let go. Don't come for me." Her hands trembled as she dropped it, the room growing cold. The shadow didn't care who it took. It moved through lives like a plague, from homes to workplaces, from vacations to nowhere at all. It fed on fear, on doubt, on the cracks in a broken soul. Thomas reached his apartment in Memphis, thinking he'd escaped. But that night, the scratching returned, inside his walls, his mind. The shadow grinned in the dark, its edges sharp as knives. Weeks later, Thomas vanished. His neighbors found frost on his windows, scratches on the door. In Hollow Creek, another tenant arrived. The cycle continued. The shadow didn't just follow, it consumed. It claimed James, then Thomas, and it wouldn't stop. It waited in the corners, in the cold, for the next to fall. You can't outrun it, you can't hide. It finds you, at home, at work, on the road. It seeps into your life, your breath, your bones. And when it does, it stays. Forever. The end wasn't James's alone. It was everyone's. The shadow spread like a curse, silent but relentless, from one soul to the next. In Hollow Creek, the cabin stood quiet. Another bus pulled in. Another set of footsteps approached. The air grew cold. The shadow waited. It always did, and it always would, because once it found you, it never let go. Never. The shadow didn't just cling, it claimed. Eleanor Grayson found the old journal in the attic of her new home in Carthage, Missouri. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages yellowed, and a faint whisper seemed to rise from it as she brushed the dust away. She'd moved here to start over. New job, new life. No more ghosts of her past haunting her every step. But that night, the whispers didn't stop. They slithered into her dreams, soft and relentless. The house was old, creaky, a fixer-upper she'd bought for next to nothing. By morning, the journal sat open on her kitchen table, though she swore she'd left it locked in the attic. Words in faded ink stared up at her. "It sees you now." A chill crawled up her spine, sharp and cold. She shoved it into a drawer, turned the key, and headed to work. desperate to shake the unease. Eleanor taught history at Carthage High, a job she'd fought hard to land. That day, the classroom felt wrong. Students shifted in their seats. The lights buzzed too loud. Mid-lecture, a whisper sliced through the air. Not hers, not theirs. "It knows you." Her voice faltered, chalk slipping from her trembling hand. The kids stared, confused, as dust drifted from the vents, though the heat wasn't running. At home, the drawer hung open, the journal back on the table. Pages flipped on their own, slowly, deliberately, revealing new words. "It follows you." Her breath caught in her throat. She grabbed it, stormed outside, and burned it in the backyard, watching flames swallow the cursed thing whole. The whispers stopped. Silence fell. Relief washed over her, fragile but real, until she went to bed. In the dark, they returned, soft, insistent, seeping from the walls. "It stays with you." Sleep became a distant memory. By dawn, dust coated her floors, thick and gray, though she'd scrubbed them spotless the day before. She swept it, up, hands shaking, but it crept back hours later, heavier, grittier, like ash from a dead fire. At school, it got worse. Dust piled in corners, whispers trailed her through empty halls. A student coughed, dry, ragged, then another, then half the class. The principal called her in, his voice sharp. "Eleanor, what's going on? You're distracted. The kids are sick." She mumbled an excuse, but the whispers hissed over her shoulder. "It owns you." Dust swirled at her feet, a silent threat. She couldn't take it. She took a vacation, fled to Savannah, Georgia, chasing sunlight and peace. The hotel room was pristine, all white sheets and polished floors until nightfall. Dust sifted from the ceiling, whispers bouncing off the walls. "It travels with you." She bolted upright, heart pounding, and checked out before sunrise, driving back to Carthage with exhaustion clawing at her mind. The house welcomed her with dust an inch thick, coating every surface like a shroud. The journal was back, unburned, open on the table, its pages scrawled with, "It never leaves." She screamed, hurling it against the wall. The whispers laughed, low, guttural, a chorus that wouldn't fade. Days blurred into a haze. At home, dust choked the air, burying furniture under its weight. At school, more kids fell ill. Parents pointed fingers at her. The whispers grew deafening. "It breaks you." Her car stalled every day, tires slashed by invisible claws. She quit her job, locked herself inside, praying it would end. It didn't. One night, the dust moved, swirling, twisting, shaping into a figure in her bedroom. It stood tall, eyeless, its form shifting like sand in a storm, whispering her name. Eleanor clawed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure reached out, dust spilling from its hands, flooding her lungs. She gasped, choking as it pressed closer, its voice a roar. "You're mine." Morning broke. The house was still. Dust vanished, journal blank. Eleanor sat on the floor, eyes hollow, skin gray as ash. Neighbors knocked, got no answer. Inside, her lips moved, a faint whisper escaping, not her voice, but its, "It sees you now." Weeks passed. The house sold again, cheap and quiet. Thomas Bailey, a writer fleeing city noise, moved in, drawn to its eerie calm. He found a journal in the attic, leather cracked, pages brittle. As he brushed the dust away, a whisper curled into the air. "It knows you." He frowned, set it on his desk, and started unpacking. That night, the whispers followed him to bed. By morning, dust coated his floors. The journal lay open, words scrawled in fresh ink. "It stays with you." Thomas laughed, a nervous, shaky sound. Old houses had their quirks, right? At his desk, writing his next novel, the whispers grew louder. Dust piled around him, pages turned on their own. "It owns you." His pen slipped, ink smearing across the paper. He stood, heart racing, and locked the journal in a drawer. It was open. Again by noon, he fled to a cabin in the Ozarks for a break, seeking solitude. The first night, dust sifted through the cracks, whispers rising from the woods. It travels with you. He drove back to Carthage, hands trembling on the wheel. The house was waiting, dust thicker, journal open. It never leaves. Thomas fought it. He burned the journal, salted the floors, called a priest. Nothing worked. The dust returned, the whispers laughed. It breaks you. His laptop crashed, manuscripts erased. Neighbors heard him shouting at nothing, then silence. One night the dust took form, a figure, eyeless, towering over his bed. It whispered his name, dust pouring into his mouth. He thrashed, but it pinned him down, voice booming, "You're mine." He stopped moving. Dawn came. The house was clean, too clean. Thomas sat in the attic, eyes blank, skin ashen. A whisper leaked from his lips, not his. The journal rested beside him, blank but heavy. Months later, a new tenant arrived, Sarah Klein, a nurse seeking a fresh start. She found the journal in the attic, dust falling from its pages. "It sees you now." She smiled, thinking it quaint, until the whispers began. The dust didn't just follow, it claimed. From Eleanor to Thomas, from Carthage to the Ozarks, it spread like a plague. It seeped into homes, workplaces, escapes, feeding on the cracks and broken lives. Sarah heard it that night, soft, insistent. Dust crept across her floor. She locked the journal away, but it was open by morning. It knows you. Her car wouldn't start that day. At the hospital, patients coughed dust in her presence. She fled to a beach house in Florida. Dust followed, whispers in the waves. It stays with you. Back in Carthage, it waited. The journal wrote itself. It owns you. Her hand shook as she burned it. Again. The dust returned, thicker, alive. It shaped her shadow on the wall, eyeless, grinning. "Sarah," it whispered. She ran, but the doors locked themselves. Dust filled her throat, her eyes, her mind. Days later, she sat still, skin gray, whispering words not hers. The house went quiet, until the next tenant arrived. The whispers didn't stop. They never would. They followed you, home, work, anywhere, until you broke, and then they took you. Forever. The dust wasn't just dust. It was alive, hungry, endless. It claimed Eleanor, then Thomas, then Sarah, each a link in its chain. It waited in Carthage, in the journal for the next to brush it free. Another bus rolled into town. Another soul stepped off. The house stood ready, dust gathering in the attic. The whispers began again, soft, patient, eternal. It sees you now, and it wouldn't let go. Never. The cycle spun on, unseen, unstoppable, claiming one life, then another, then another. The dust settled, only to rise again. In Carthage, the house waited, silent, but never empty. The whispers waited too. They always did. Because once they found you, they stayed, through every home, every job, every desperate flight, until you were theirs. The dust didn't just whisper, it consumed. Always. Thomas Reed felt it first on the drive home from Asheville, North Carolina, a prickle on his neck like someone watching from the back seat. He glanced in the rearview mirror, nothing but empty seats and the dim glow of passing headlights. He'd spent the weekend hiking alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a break from his soul-crushing job in Charlotte. Exhausted, he blamed it on fatigue, imagination running wild, but the feeling clung to him. At his cramped apartment in Charlotte, the air turned thick, the silence oppressive. He dropped his keys on the counter, clink, and they slid off the edge on their own, clattering to the floor. He froze. A shadow darted across the wall, too fast, too jagged. "Hello?" His voice bounced back, unanswered. That night, he woke to breathing, not his own. Slow, shallow, Too close. The room was pitch black, but something pressed against the mattress, a weight beside him. He bolted upright, heart hammering. Nothing there. Just the hum of the AC and a faint creak from the hallway, like footsteps retreating. At work the next day, it followed. Thomas was a data analyst, trapped in a gray cubicle at a soulless firm. His monitor flickered, files vanished, mid-save. A coworker, James, leaned over the partition. "You okay, man? You're pale as hell." Thomas nodded, but the lights buzzed violently, and a chair rolled across the room, empty. James flinched. What the hell was that? Back home, the breathing returned, louder, wetter, echoing from the living room. Thomas grabbed a baseball bat, searched every corner, nothing. But his TV snapped on, static at first, then a shadow in the screen. Too tall, too thin, edges twitching. He yanked the plug from the wall. The screen stayed lit, the shadow growing. He called in sick the next day, drove to Myrtle Beach for a desperate escape. The hotel was bright, bustling, safe, he told himself. But at midnight, the breathing was back, right beside his ear, hot and damp. The mirror fogged up, a handprint forming, fingers too long, too bony. He stumbled to his car, but the radio hissed static, then a voice. "You can't leave me." Back in Charlotte, it worsened. His fridge door swung open on its own, food rotting overnight, maggots writhing in the meat. At work, his desk drawers slammed shut on his hands. Bruises bloomed purple and black. James quit after a stapler flew at his head, missing by inches. Thomas begged his boss for remote work. "Fix yourself, Reed," was the cold reply. He turned to a priest, Father Michael, an old college friend. They stood in the apartment, praying over flickering candles. The breathing turned to a growl, low, guttural, shaking the walls. Father Michael paled, sweat beading on his brow. "This isn't normal, Thomas. It's inside you." He fled, cross trembling in his hand, leaving Thomas alone. The shadow wasn't just a shape anymore. It loomed over him, faceless, suffocating. The breathing synced with his own, a rhythm he couldn't break. He ran to his car, sped down empty streets, tires screeched, the engine died. The passenger seat creaked, sinking under an unseen weight. He screamed, pounding the wheel. Back home, he locked every door, pointless. The shadow stood in his kitchen, breathing louder, wetter, a stench like decay rolling off it. "What do you want?" he shouted, voice cracking. The lights shattered, glass raining down, cutting his arms. A voice, not his, rumbled from his chest. "You." He clawed at himself, nails drawing blood, desperate to rip it out. The shadow pressed closer, its weight crushing his ribs. His reflection in the window twisted, eyes black as tar, mouth stretched too wide. He collapsed, gasping, as it sank into him, cold, final, absolute. Days later, his boss found him at his desk, still staring, unblinking. "Reed?" Thomas's head turned, slow and unnatural. His voice rasped, "Leave." The office plunged into darkness, screams erupting as chairs toppled and desks flipped on their own. Police checked his apartment, empty, save for a handprint burned into the wall, fingers too long, too thin. At the Myrtle Beach Hotel, staff reported breathing from his old room, unoccupied, door locked. His car was found abandoned, passenger seat torn apart. Thomas vanished, but it didn't. In Asheville, a new hiker, Sarah Klein, drove down the mountain road. She felt it. A prickle on her neck, a glance in the mirror. Nothing there. Yet the air grew heavy, her keys slipping from the dash to the floor. At her Raleigh apartment, the breathing started that night. Soft, steady, beside her bed. She checked the locks, secure, but the mirror fogged, a handprint forming. At her nursing job, lights flickered, charts scattered across the floor. "You okay, Sarah?" a colleague asked. She nodded, but a stretcher rolled down the hall, empty. She fled to Savannah for a weekend. Breathing followed, louder in the hotel room. Her phone buzzed static, then a voice. You can't leave me." Back home, her fridge rotted, her car died. At work, a scalpel flew past her face. She called a priest. Useless. The shadow loomed, breathing synced with hers. She ran to her car. Passenger seat creaked. "What do you want?" she screamed. Her voice answered, "You." It sank into her, cold and deep. Days later, she sat at her desk, eyes black, unblinking. Colleagues fled as lights shattered. Her apartment was empty, handprint on the wall. In Savannah, breathing echoed from her room. Sarah vanished, but it lingered. In Asheville, another hiker, James Holt, felt it. A prickle, a glance. The cycle rolled on. It didn't just follow, it rode with you. Home, work, vacation, nowhere was safe. It slipped into your car, your bed, your breath, waiting to claim you. Thomas was first, Sarah next, James after. The shadow didn't tire, it hungered. It sank into lives, breaking them apart, piece by piece. In Charlotte, Thomas's apartment sat vacant, breathing echoed at night. In Raleigh, Sarah's car rusted, passenger seat slashed. In Asheville, James drove home, mirror empty, until it wasn't. The prickle spread, soft, subtle, a passenger no one saw coming. It breathed in the dark, waiting for the next to feel it. And they did. Always. The unseen didn't just watch, it took. It rode beside you, silent until it wasn't, claiming everything you had. Another car left Asheville. Another neck prickled. The mirror stayed empty. Until the breathing began. It wouldn't stop. Never. The passenger didn't leave. It stayed. A weight you couldn't shake. A shadow you couldn't see. It followed Thomas home, to work, to the beach. Then Sarah, then James. In every town, every life, it waited. Patient. Relentless. It sank into your skin, your soul, until you weren't you anymore. James felt it that night, breathing beside him. His keys slid off the counter. The shadow flickered on the wall. He ran, useless. The car creaked. The voice came, "You." It sank in. Days later, he sat still, eyes black, breath not his. The cycle churned on. The unseen passenger didn't rest. It rode with you, everywhere, always, until it owned you, forever. In Asheville, another hiker climbed the trail. The prickle began, soft, cold, inevitable. The shadow waited, it always did, because once it chose you, it stayed. Through every mile, every breath, every scream, until you were gone. The passenger didn't just ride, it consumed, always. In Charlotte, Raleigh, Savannah, Asheville, it spread, a silent plague in the dark. Another car rolled out, another mirror fogged. The breathing grew loud. It wouldn't stop, never. The unseen didn't just follow, it claimed, one soul at a time, relentless and eternal. In every seat, every shadow it sat, waiting, breathing, taking. Thomas was gone. Sarah was gone, James was gone, but it wasn't. It rode on. Always. The passenger didn't leave. It lived. A weight no road could outrun. In Asheville, the mountains stood silent. Another hiker packed their car. The prickle came. The mirror stayed empty. For now. But the breathing was there. Soft. Steady. Waiting. It always was. And it always would be. The unseen passenger didn't just ride. It owned forever, always. Sarah Klein heard it first in the hollow of Blackthorn Ridge, Kentucky. A low, mournful hum rising from the trees. She'd come to photograph the abandoned coal town for her blog, a weekend escape from her chaotic life in Louisville. The sound wasn't wind. It pulsed, alive, tugging at her chest like a heartbeat. She snapped a picture, click, and the hum stopped, leaving silence too heavy to bear. Back in Louisville, it followed. Her apartment felt wrong, Lights dimmed without reason, the air thick and still. She uploaded her photos, Blackthorn's crumbling shacks, rusted tracks, and froze. In one frame, a blur stood, vaguely human, staring back with hollow eyes. The hum returned, soft, insistent, leaking from her speakers. That night it woke her, a hum vibrating through the walls, rattling her bones. She stumbled to the living room. Her laptop glowed, the photo open, the blur sharper now, its eyes black pits. She slammed it shut, heart pounding, but the hum lingered, threading into her skull like a parasite. At work it spread. Sarah was a barista at a bustling downtown cafe. The espresso machine whined off key, cups tipped over untouched. A regular, Thomas, frowned over his latte. "You hear that humming?" She nodded, throat tight. The lights flickered and a tray crashed behind her, empty, spinning on the floor. Home again, the hum grew louder, rattling windows, shaking shelves. Her phone buzzed. Photos from Blackthorn she hadn't taken, the blur closer, arms outstretched, like claws. She deleted them, hands trembling, but they reappeared hours later, the hum now a wail that clawed at her mind. She fled to Nashville for a break, rented an Airbnb, craving silence. But that night the hum seeped through the floorboards, low and mournful, a dirge from nowhere. Her camera clicked on its own, snap, capturing the blur in the room, looming over her bed, its form sharper, gray, and gaunt. She screamed, ran to her car. The radio wailed the same hum, inescapable. Back in Louisville it turned vicious. Her mirrors cracked, reflecting the blur instead of her, eyes hollow, mouth gaping. At the cafe the hum drowned out chatter. Customers fled, coffee burned black in the pot, steam hissing like a curse. Thomas grabbed her arm, eyes wide. "What's wrong with you?" She shook him off. The hum snarled in her ears, a living thing. She called a friend, Eleanor, for help. They sat in her apartment, the hum pulsing through the air like a heartbeat. Eleanor paled, voice trembling. "It's coming from you, Sarah." The lights blew out, glass popping, the blur flickering in the dark. Tall, gaunt, hollow-eyed, reaching. Eleanor bolted, leaving Sarah alone with the sound. The hum was everywhere. Her car stalled daily, tires flattened by unseen hands. At work, the cafe shut down, equipment fried, walls humming like a hive, customers coughing up black dust. She locked herself in her apartment, but the blur stood in her kitchen. Real now, flesh gray and rotting, mouth gaping wide. The hum roared, "Mine!" She clawed at her ears, blood trickling down her neck, desperate to silence it. The blur lunged, its hum filling her chest, her throat, her soul. She choked, vision fading as it sank into her, vibrating, alive, eternal, claiming every breath she had left. Days later, Eleanor returned. Sarah sat motionless, staring, eyes hollow as pits. "Sarah?" Her voice hummed low and wrong. Gone. The room shook, windows shattering outward, the hum a scream. Eleanor ran, the sound chasing her down the stairs into the night. The cafe stayed closed. Customers swore they heard humming from inside, a mournful wail through the walls. Sarah's apartment was empty, photos scattered across the floor, the blur in every frame closer each time. In Nashville, the Airbnb host reported a hum from her old room. No one there, but the air vibrated. Sarah vanished, but it didn't. In Blackthorn Ridge, a new visitor, James Holt, snapped a photo. Click. The hum rose, soft and mournful from the hollow, threading into his ears. He drove back to Cincinnati, the sound trailing him like a shadow. At home it began. Lights dimmed. His camera clicked without him. Photos appeared. Blackthorn, the blur staring back, hollow eyes sharp. The hum woke him that night, vibrating. The bed. At his mechanic shop, tools rattled on their own, a wrench flying past his head. "You hear that?" A coworker asked. James nodded. The hum snarled back. He fled to Gatlinburg for a weekend. The hum followed, echoing through the cabin. His phone buzzed. New photos, the blur closer, arms reaching. Back in Cincinnati, Mirrors cracked. The hum a wail. At work, the shop shook. Cars died. Oil turned black. He locked himself in. The blur stood there, real, gray, humming, mine. James fought it, smashed his camera, burned the photos. Useless. The hum roared, the blur lunged, sinking into him. He choked, collapsing as it claimed him, vibrating, endless. Days later, he sat in the shop, eyes hollow, voice humming, gone. The walls shook, tools flew. His house was empty, photos everywhere, the blur staring. In Gatlinburg, the cabin hummed at night. James vanished, but it lingered. In Blackthorn, another visitor, Eleanor Gray, snapped a photo. Click. The hum rose, mournful and alive. It followed her home. The echoes didn't stop. They spread. From Sarah to James, from Louisville to Cincinnati, it hummed through lives, homes, jobs, escapes breaking them apart. It sank into you, a sound you couldn't outrun. Eleanor felt it in Lexington. Lights dimmed, her camera clicked. Photos showed the blur, hollow eyes watching. At her bookstore, shelves trembled, books fell. The hum wailed in her ears. She fled to Asheville. The hum followed, rattling the hotel. Her phone buzzed, new photos, the blur reaching. Back home, mirrors cracked, the hum roared. At work, the store shook, pages turned black. She locked herself in. The blur stood there, humming mine. She fought, burned the photos, smashed the camera. The hum roared, the blur sank in. She choked, falling as it claimed her. Days later, she sat, eyes hollow, voice humming. Gone. The store shook, shelves crashed. Her house was empty, photos everywhere. In Asheville, the hotel hummed. Eleanor vanished, but it didn't. In Blackthorn, another camera clicked. Click. The hum rose again. It wouldn't stop. Never. The echoes didn't just follow, they consumed. From hollow to hollow, life to life, they hummed. Relentless, eternal, claiming all they touched. In Louisville, Sarah's cafe sat silent, humming, at night. In Cincinnati, James's shop rusted, tools vibrating. In Lexington, Eleanor's store stood empty, pages humming in the dark. Another visitor climbed Blackthorn Ridge. Another camera clicked. The hum began, soft, mournful, alive. It followed them home, always. The hollow didn't just echo, it hungered. It sank into you, home, work, everywhere, until you were its voice, its hum. In every town, every life, it waited, patient, vibrating, claiming. Sarah was first, James next, Eleanor after, each a note in its endless song. Another car rolled into Blackthorn, another shutter clicked. The hum rose, soft, steady, inevitable. It wouldn't stop. Never. The echoes didn't just sound, they took. They hummed through you, every room, every breath, until you were hollow too. In Blackthorn, the trees stood silent. Another visitor arrived. The hum waited, soft, alive, eternal. It always did, and it always would, because once it found you, it stayed, through every mile, every scream, every shutter click, until you were gone. The hollow didn't just hum, it claimed, always. In every photo, every life, it spread, a sound that consumed, relentless and deep. Another lens focused on Blackthorn. Another hum began, low, mournful, alive. It followed them home, forever. The echoes didn't fade. They grew, a chorus of the hollow, claiming one soul after another. In Louisville, Cincinnati, Lexington, it hummed, a plague in the air. Another visitor stepped into the hollow. Another photo clicked. The hum rose, soft, steady, eternal. It wouldn't stop, never. The hollow didn't just echo, it lived. A sound that took you everywhere, always. In every frame, every breath, it waited, vibrating, claiming, consuming. Sarah was gone, James was gone, Eleanor was gone, but it wasn't. It hummed on, always. The echoes didn't just follow, they owned. James Holt saw it first on the motel wall in Marlow, Oklahoma, a dark, wet stain spreading like ink across the peeling paint. He'd stopped there overnight, road tripping from Tulsa to clear his head after a brutal breakup. The stain wasn't there when he checked in. It just appeared, slick and gleaming under the dim light. He touched it, cold, sticky, and the room filled with a rust-like stench that clung to his skin. Back in Tulsa, it followed. His apartment walls bloomed with stains, dark, damp, creeping up from the baseboards like a rising tide. He scrubbed them, hours of bleach and sweat stinging his eyes, but they seeped back by morning, bigger, blacker, pulsing faintly. The air turned sour, metallic, like blood coating his tongue. That night, he woke to dripping, slow, steady, from the ceiling. No leak, no source, just a stain above his bed, oozing something thick and red onto his pillow. He moved the mattress. Next night it was there again, dripping onto his face, cold and wet. He gagged, tasting rust, feeling it smear across his lips. At work, it spread. James was a line cook at a diner, grease-stained but steady work. The kitchen walls darkened, stains pooling near the grill, slick and wet, like oil gone bad. Pans, rusted overnight, food spoiled in hours, meat turning gray, bread molding fast. A waitress, Sarah, wrinkled her nose over the counter. "What's that smell?" He shrugged. The stain crept closer to his station, glistening. Home again, the stains worsened. Floors slick with red, furniture warped and stained as if soaked in blood. His mirror clouded with a stain, his reflection blurred behind it, eyes smudged out. He smashed it. Shards hit the floor, stained red by morning, sticky underfoot. The dripping turned to a pour, ceiling weeping onto him at night, soaking his clothes. He fled to Galveston for a vacation, beach air, a clean slate to breathe. The rental was spotless, white walls, fresh sheets, until midnight. Stains bled through the walls, dark and wet, pooling on the hardwood floor. The bed dripped red, soaking the sheets through, cold against his skin. He ran to his car. Stains smeared the windows, rust streaking the hood like veins. Back in Tulsa, it turned cruel. His walls pulsed with stains, like veins throbbing under skin, red and alive. At the diner, the stains spread. Customers gagged. On food gone rancid mid-bite, Sarah quit after a pot boiled over with red sludge. James begged his boss to close early. No dice. "You're the problem, Holt," he snapped, wiping a stain off his sleeve. He called his ex, Eleanor, for help. She'd always been practical, grounded. She came over, saw the stains pulsing. On the walls, smelled the rust thick in the air. "James, it's you, it's on you," she whispered, voice shaking. The ceiling dripped red onto her hair. She screamed and fled, the stains smearing her coat as she ran. The stains were everywhere. His clothes reeked of rust. His car rusted through overnight, frame buckling. At work, the diner shut down. Health. Violations piled up. Stains bleeding from the walls, floors slick with red. He locked himself in his apartment. The stain pooled around him, thick and alive, rising up his legs like floodwater. It whispered his name, low and wet, seeping into his ears. He fought, scrubbed with bleach, screamed until his throat bled, clawed at the stain with raw hands. It climbed higher, coating his chest, his throat, cold and relentless. He gasped, drowning in it as it sank in, rust and blood filling his lungs, final and absolute. Days later, his boss kicked down the door. James sat there, stained red from head to toe, eyes blank and glassy. "Holt?" James's voice gurgled up, wet and wrong and stay. The walls wept red, the floor pulsed like a heart. The boss ran, slipping in the slick mess, choking on the stench. The diner stayed closed. Stains oozed from every crack, rust eating the building alive. James's apartment was empty. Walls, dripping red, air thick with the smell of blood. In Galveston, the rental reeked. Stains smeared the bed, floors warped and wet. James vanished, but it didn't. In Marlow, a new guest, Eleanor Gray, checked into the motel. A stain bloomed on the wall, dark, wet, alive, spreading as she unpacked. She touched it, cold, sticky, and the room smelled like rust. Back in Austin, it followed. Her house walls darkened, stains creeping up red and wet. She scrubbed them. They bled back stronger. At her law office, stains pooled on files, desks rusted, clients coughed on a metallic stench. "What's that smell?" a partner asked. She lied. The stain smeared her chair. Home again, it dripped, ceiling weeping red onto her bed. She fled to San Antonio. Stains bled through the hotel, rust streaking the walls. Back in Austin, mirrors cracked, stains pulsed. At work, the office shut down, stains everywhere, papers soaked red. She called a friend, useless. The stain rose around her, whispering her name. She fought, scrubbed, screamed, clawed. It sank in, cold, wet, final. Days later, she sat, stained red, eyes blank, gurgling, "Stay." The house pulsed, walls wept. In San Antonio, the hotel reeked. Eleanor vanished, but it lingered. In Marlow, another guest, Thomas Reed, saw the stain, dark, wet, alive. It followed him home. The stain didn't stop. It spread. From James to Eleanor, Tulsa to Austin, it bled through lives, homes, jobs, escapes, claiming all it touched. Thomas felt it in Dallas. Walls stained, air rusted. At his warehouse job, stains pooled, tools bled red. He fled to Houston, stains followed, dripping in the motel. Back home, it pulsed, whispering his name. He fought, scrubbed, ran, screamed. The stain sank in, wet, cold, final. He sat, stained, gurgling, "Stay." The warehouse wept red. Thomas vanished, but it didn't. In Marlow, another stain bloomed, dark, alive. It wouldn't stop. Never. The stain didn't just follow, it consumed. From life to life, it spread, relentless, wet, claiming all in its path. In Tulsa, James's diner rusted away. In Austin, Eleanor's office bled. In Dallas, Thomas's warehouse reeked. Another car rolled into Marlow. Another stain appeared, dark, wet, alive. It followed them home, always. The stain didn't fade, it grew. It sank into you, home, work, everywhere, until you were its mark, its rust. In every town, it waited, patient, dripping, claiming. James was first, Eleanor next, Thomas after, each a smear in its wake. Another guest checked in. Another stain bloomed, soft, wet, inevitable. It wouldn't stop, never. The stain didn't just mark, it took. It bled through you, every wall, every breath, until you were gone. In Marlow, the motel stood quiet. Another traveler arrived. The stain waited, dark, alive, eternal. It always did, and it always would. Because once it touched you, it stayed. Through every mile, every scream, every scrub, until you were its. The stain didn't just follow, it owned, always. In every life it spread, a wet plague, relentless and deep. Another wall darkened in Marlow. Another stain bled, low, wet, alive. It followed them home forever. The stain didn't rest, it grew, a mark that claimed one soul after another. In Tulsa, Austin, Dallas, it bled, a rust that consumed the air. Another traveler stopped in Marlow. Another stain appeared. The rust rose, soft, steady, eternal. It wouldn't stop. Never. The stain didn't just spread, it lived, a wet curse that took you, everywhere, always. In every room, every life it waited, dripping, claiming, consuming. James was gone, Eleanor was gone, Thomas was gone. But it wasn't. It stained on, always. The stain didn't just follow, it became you. In Marlow, the motel stood, silent, waiting. Another guest arrived. The stain bloomed, dark, wet, alive. It followed them home, always. The rust didn't fade. It claimed a wet shadow that spread through all. In every town it waited, patient, relentless, eternal. Another wall wept red. Another stain rose, soft, wet, inevitable. It wouldn't stop. Never. The stain didn't just mark, it consumed, a rust that lived in you, everywhere, always. In every breath it sank, dripping, claiming, owning. James was its, Eleanor was its, Thomas was its, but it wasn't done. It stained on, always. The stain didn't just follow, it ended. Eleanor Gray felt it first in the diner bathroom in Jericho, Vermont, a cold breath fogging the mirror as she washed her hands. She'd stopped there for coffee, driving through on a solo trip to forget her crumbling career in Boston. No one else was there, just her and the fog spreading slow and deliberate across the cracked glass. She wiped it off, smear, and it bloomed back, thicker, colder. Back in Boston it followed, her apartment mirrors fogged. Every time she passed, a haze she couldn't clear. She checked the vents. No draft, no leak, nothing but damp air pressing in. The room turned heavy like someone breathing too close unseen. She woke to fog on her bedroom window inside, curling into shapes like fingerprints tracing the pane. That night, it pressed harder. A breath on her neck, cold and wet, raising goosebumps. She spun around. Nothing but fog on the glass, spreading, fast, clouding her reflection. She flung the window open. Useless. The fog grew thicker, the breath louder, brushing her ear like a whisper she couldn't shake. At work, it spread. Eleanor was a librarian at a small branch, quiet, orderly. Her refuge, the windows fogged, smudged streaks no cloth could clean. Books dampened, pages curling overnight, ink smearing. A clerk, Thomas, shivered by the desk, rubbing his arms. Feel that chill? She nodded. The breath grazed her cheek, icy and close. Home again, the fog thickened. Mirrors clouded blind. Windows wept condensation in steady drips. Her phone screen fogged, breath smearing at mid-call, distorting her voice. She dropped it. The breath hissed in her hair, a damp caress. She screamed, swatting at nothing. Fog swirled around her feet like smoke. She fled to Portland, Maine for a break, coastal clarity to breathe again. The rental was crisp, clean, glass, salt air, until night. Fog crept up the windows, breath fogging the glass inside, tracing her name in shaky lines. She ran outside, her car windshield fogged, breath steaming from nowhere, clouding the night. Back in Boston, it turned cruel. Her mirrors fogged black, reflecting nothing but haze. No face, no light. At the library, fog choked the air. Patrons coughed on damp mist, books rotted with mold overnight. Thomas quit after a shelf fell, unpushed, crashing near his feet. "You're cursed," he muttered, eyeing her. The breath pressed her neck, a constant chill. She called her brother, James, for help. Practical, skeptical, her anchor. He arrived, saw the fog on every glass, felt the breath brush his skin. "It's on you, El," he said, voice tight with fear. The windows fogged solid. Breath roared. In their ears, a hiss of intent. He ran. The fog clung to his back like a shroud. The breath was everywhere. Her car fogged inside, engine dead under damp weight. At work, the library closed. Mold spread through the stacks. Fog choked every corner. Lights dimmed wet. She locked herself in her apartment. The fog pressed the glass, breath forming a face, pale, eyeless, mouth gaping. It hissed her name, low and wet. She fought, wiped mirrors raw, cracked windows wide, screamed at the fog until her voice broke. The fog tightened, breath filling her lungs, cold, damp, alive, pressing her chest. She choked, clawing at air as it sank in, final, suffocating, claiming her whole. Days later, James kicked in her door. Eleanor sat there, fogged eyes unseeing, breath steaming from her mouth in slow curls. "El?" Her voice rasped up. "Here." The room fogged black, glass cracking in sharp snaps. He fled. The breath grazed his neck, cold and clinging. The library stayed shut, fog seeping from the walls, a damp rot no one could stop. Eleanor's apartment was empty, mirrors fogged solid, air thick and wet. In Portland, the rental reeked, breath lingered on every glass, tracing faint names. Eleanor vanished, but it didn't. In Jericho, a new traveler, Thomas Reed, paused at the diner for a break. The mirror fogged, breath curling slow and cold across the glass. He wiped it, smear, and it bloomed back heavier. Back in Concord, it followed. His house windows fogged, breath inside, tracing lines. At his mechanic shop, fog clouded tools, engines rusted wet. "Feel that chill?" a coworker asked. He nodded, breath brushed his ear. Home again, mirrors fogged black. Breath hissed. He fled to Burlington. Fog crept up the motel glass, breath steaming his name. Back in Concord, it pressed. Shop closed. Fog choked the air. He fought, cracked windows, wiped glass. The fog sank in. Breath filled him, cold and wet. He sat, fogged, eyes rasping, here. The house fogged black. Thomas vanished, but it lingered. In Jericho, another traveler, Sarah Klein, stopped. The mirror fogged, breath curling slow. It followed her home. The breath didn't stop, it spread. From Eleanor to Thomas, Boston to Concord, it fogged lives, homes, jobs, escapes, claiming all it touched. Sarah felt it in Albany. Windows fogged, breath hissed. At her bakery, fog dampened dough, ovens rusted. She fled to Syracuse. Breath fogged the hotel glass. Back home it pressed. Bakery shut. Fog choked her. She fought, wiped mirrors, screamed. The fog sank in. Breath claimed her. She sat, fogged, rasping, here. The house fogged black. Sarah vanished, but it didn't. In Jericho, another mirror fogged, breath curling slow. It wouldn't stop. Never. The breath didn't just follow, it consumed. From glass to glass, life to life, it spread, relentless, damp, claiming all. In Boston, Eleanor's library rotted. In Concord, Thomas's shop rusted. In Albany, Sarah's bakery fogged. Another car paused in Jericho. Another mirror fogged, breath curling cold. It followed them home, always. The fog didn't fade. It grew. It sank into you, home, work, everywhere, until you were its haze, its breath. In every town it waited, patient, fogging, claiming. Eleanor was first, Thomas next, Sarah after, each a smear in its mist. Another traveler stopped, another glass fogged, soft, cold, inevitable. It wouldn't stop. Never. The breath didn't just fog, it took. It pressed through you, every pain, every lung, until you were gone. In Jericho, the diner stood quiet. Another soul arrived. The breath waited, slow, damp, eternal. It always did, and it always would. Because once it breathed on you, it stayed. Through every mile, every scream, every wipe, until you were its. The fog didn't just cloud, it owned, always. In every life it spread, a damp plague, relentless and deep. Another mirror fogged in Jericho. Another breath curled, low, cold, alive. It followed them home, forever. The breath didn't rest, it grew, a fog that claimed one soul after another. In Boston, Concord, Albany, it fogged, a mist that consumed the air. Another traveler paused in Jericho. Another glass steamed. The breath rose, soft, steady, eternal. It wouldn't stop, never. The fog didn't just spread, it lived, a damp curse that took you everywhere, always, in every room, every life it waited, fogging, claiming, consuming. Eleanor was gone. Thomas was gone. Sarah was gone. But it wasn't. It breathed on. Always. The breath didn't just follow. It became you. In Jericho, the diner stood, silent, waiting. Another guest arrived. The fog bloomed, cold, wet, alive. It followed them home, always. The breath didn't fade, it claimed a mist that spread through all. In every town it waited, patient, relentless, eternal. Another glass fogged red. Another breath rose, soft, wet, inevitable. It wouldn't stop. Never. The fog didn't just cloud, it consumed, a breath that lived in you everywhere. Always. In every pain, every soul, it sank, fogging, claiming, owning. Eleanor was its. Thomas was its. Sarah was its. But it wasn't done. It fogged on. Always. The breath didn't just follow, it ended. In Jericho, the road stretched, silent, cold. Another car rolled in. The glass fogged, breath curling slow, it followed them home forever. The fog didn't rest, it claimed, a breath that took one life after another. In every city it spread, a damp curse in the air. Another traveler stopped in Jericho. Another mirror steamed. The breath rose, soft, cold, eternal. It wouldn't stop. Never. The fog didn't just fog, it lived, a breath that consumed you, everywhere, always. In every glass, every life it waited, claiming, fogging, owning. Eleanor was lost, Thomas was lost, Sarah was lost. But it wasn't. It breathed on, always. The breath didn't just follow, it took all. Hear that creak? Feel that chill? You're not alone anymore. They followed you here. Don't break the curse. Spread it. Subscribe to Mysteries Beyond Death to join the hunted. Smash that like button to fend off the shadows. Ring the bell. So they find you next, and drop a comment with what haunts you. Let's see if they answer. Stay cursed with us.